All right, I made it. Wow, cool. Great to be with everybody this morning. And I had a 3-point sermon. I think I might amend that just a little bit. It's obviously a really busy time of the year for us. And so great welcoming some special guests with us this morning in addition to the Colossians. And didn't you find that inspiring what the Colossians had to share this morning? So great having you here. Fantastic. I'm so grateful that the Colossians have come to join us, and what an inspiring story. And so appreciate it. But we also have some guests with us this morning that I wanted to introduce. Lauren Rasmussen's parents are here from Albuquerque right here. He's one of the elders of the church. Go ahead and stand on up. Great to have him. And then always excited to have Joe and Vanessa Mulligan here this morning right here. And then some special friends from Spokane, Aldo and Holly right back here are from Spokane here as well. So summertime's always fun for making new friends. We've been, the last few weeks, we've been doing a special series entitled, Blessed are the Peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God. As we look at our world, I'm struck by how often it just seems that there's a lack of peace in our world. And there is a need for peace worldwide between nations. The U.S. military kind of shook this week because the Chinese announced that they've created this weapon. They're pouring all that extra money they have into this super aircraft carrier killer that could knock our aircraft carriers out of the water there in the South China Sea. So it's like the world shook a little bit. Because traditionally mankind has fought with each other. There's a need for peace between men. There's a need for peace between ourselves and God. As often in our lives, we lack peace. You know, Jesus said when you go into a house and when He sent out His disciples, you enter a house, first say, peace to this house. And this last week I was over at Dan and Donna Carnes' house, and I walked in the house and they said, well, what do you say? I said, peace to this house! And glad to be able to say that. But God wants to give us peace. He said in Ephesians chapter 2, remember that at that time you were separate from Christ, excluded from citizenship in Israel, and foreigners to the covenants of the promise, without hope and without God in the world. You know, in the world we're without hope, and we need peace between us and God. You know, Chris and Becky's story. Chris's story is very inspiring. I wish he had a chance to share it more, but his father, he reconciled with his father. His father had been married 5 different times. He reconciled with his father. His father became a Christian. And for about several years now, they meet every Thursday for the breakfast until he moved out here to talk about their Christian faith. And they've become super close. See, God makes peace in our lives. I'm so thankful for the peace that was made in my life when I became a Christian. You know, my Suzanne's, both of her parents had passed away prior to her getting out of high school. And when we got married, you know, my father was from an alcoholic past, and I had a lot of craziness in my head, and then she had this kind of background thing, and we had a rough time in our marriage the first couple of years. And there was a period of time where I went into one of my kids' bedrooms, and I was there asleep, and I just started to cry. I was like, God, am I going to lose my marriage? I mean, we were struggling with each other, and I got down on my knees, and I prayed, God, help us. And then some people really reached out to us and spent time together, and we got great help in our marriage. And this year we're going to celebrate 25 years of being married together. And honestly, I love Suzanne more now than ever. She looks so beautiful today. I just wanted to share that. It's so special. Having her not with me for a few weeks reminds me of how special it is. God brings peace into our lives. And as a result, He calls on Christians to be peacemakers. And He tells us in the Beatitude a series of 8 attitudes to have that if we will embrace, we will become peacemakers. And God will use us to bring peace into the lives of the people around us. And how much we need to do that. We need to become that. And so these last few weeks, we've had a sermon series. Last week, we covered impact of a peacemaker. And my thought was that I would cover attitudes of a peacemaker today. But we're going to cut that down to attitude of a peacemaker. Because unless you want me to go through like all 7 of the Beatitudes till, you know, later this afternoon. No, we won't do that. But I did want to talk about that Jesus comes along and He gives us a series of things to embrace, the heart of a true Christian. And He does it because on His heart, Jesus has come to bring good news. He says here in Isaiah 61, the Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives, and release from darkness for the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn. That is the framework. That is the message that Jesus was living out when He came and delivered the Beatitudes. And if you look here in Matthew chapter 5, we'll pick it up with the very first Beatitude. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Jesus comes along, and He's looking out at a group of people, and He tells them this. And it says that they are His disciples in chapter 2, or in verse 2 of chapter 5 of the book of Matthew. But He starts off and He says, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. If you could stand there, we don't totally relate to this verse. You have to try and go back in time a little bit to relate to this verse. But imagine that you're standing delivering a sermon to a very poor group of people. I'm going to skip past some of the things. That you are delivering a sermon to a poor group of people. This last week I saw a special from the Today Show by Ann Curry where she went and she followed these four families in the Midwest who are really struggling financially. And they've gone through a lot of challenges. And one guy was an out-of-work crane operator that had been out of work for about a year. And another was 14 people in one house because just about everybody was unemployed. They're all living on about $600 a month. And as she was detailing this, you were just moved in your spirit seeing the things these people were going through. And I think our country in general is getting in touch more with what it means to really struggle on some of these fronts. And that sermon, for Jesus to present the statement, blessed are the poor, would ring true with them. They would say, I want to hear that. I want to hear what you have to say, Jesus, because I am poor. Now, we don't identify with that quite as much here in America because we're typically not poor. In fact, most people that I look at today are pretty well off. You might feel a bit poor, but not like this. And so He's talking to a very poor group of people, and He says, blessed are the poor in spirit. And they're going to identify with this, and He says, blessed are those who mourn. You'll be comforted. And you get a sense for Jesus' heart, just how good, what a beautiful spirit Jesus had. When He wanted to tell these people, I'll give you a message that will touch you. But He tells them, blessed are the poor in spirit. And what that is, it's the Greek word patokos, which means to reduce to beggary. And it comes from the Greek word patasao, which means to crouch. He's saying if we want to be peacemakers, there is an internal spirit that we need to have as we relate to God. That we come to God with a sense inside of us, God, I really do need you. I need to be near you. And sometimes we don't exactly relate to what this means. So I wanted to show us a little video clip this morning. We get to go to the movies this morning. And, I don't think we always relate to what does it mean to be poor in spirit towards God. And to come to God and say to Him, God, I really do need you. I need to be near you. And there are so many things that at times that we substitute for a dependence on God. Sometimes we just rely on ourselves. Sometimes we rely kind of on our material well-being. Sometimes we rely on our career. Sometimes we rely on our families. But there are many things that, being from an affluent, pretty well-to-do culture, we don't feel the same sort of desperation to rely on God like the kind of poor people that Jesus was talking to in the first century. And so I wanted to show us this video clip, and it's from a movie that Russell Crowe is in called The Cinderella Man. And it's this guy, Jim Corbett, who was a professional fighter, and then he got hurt in the middle of the Depression, and he became really poor. And I wanted you to relate to this as you see what he goes through to remind you of what it means to be poor in spirit or how we ought to approach God. So I'll let us watch this together. When Jesus says, blessed are the poor in spirit, I think you can relate to that person. He was, those were all his former associates that all once thought he was going to become the champion of the world, and he eventually does become the champion of the world. His name's James Braddock. And yet his life, he's so broken down, and he's so humbled That he now is capable of going back to his associates. His family's about to get put into the street, and he's so desperate that he says, I'll even go back. That was his former manager there at the end. I'll even go back to my former manager with my hat in my hand and beg for help. And you see you sort of get that feeling, don't you, when you're watching that, like, oh my goodness. And you kind of feel bad for him. And it's making you feel uncomfortable. And that last interaction with his manager, he goes up and he apologizes to his manager, and his manager goes, man, what do you have to apologize for? And he gets the money out and he puts it in the plate. But it's because he's desperate at that moment to take care of his family. He's desperate for help. Jesus spoke to a group of people like that in the first century. And he said, blessed, happy you will be who are poor like that, who are a beggar who crouches down. You sort of saw James Braddock kind of hunch down a little and put his head down. And that's literally what this term poor in spirit means. It means to kind of crouch down. And he's saying that those people who can be that way with the Lord, they're blessed. They're blessed. Because he says, when they do that with me, I say, yours is the kingdom of heaven, and I throw my arms around them. And I say, you now belong to me. Blessed are you who mourn, and those who have lost like this, do mourn. You're going to be comforted. At some point in our lives, everyone comes to realize, whether they're rich financially or not, the need at some point to be poor in spirit, no matter how well off you are. And perhaps it's not till your day standing at the very last day of your life and you realize death is going to overtake me. I cannot fight it. You know, the writer of the book of Ecclesiastes, it's a great book because he starts off, he's got so much going for him. He's the richest man in the world, the wisest man in the world, probably Solomon writing it. And he starts off building great projects, gardens. Then he moves on to pleasure. And finally comes full circle and he's empty inside. And he says, the truth of the matter is, myself and everyone else, we're all going to die. And at that moment, he's poor in spirit. He realized, I cannot resist this. See, each of us will suffer loss at some point. Perhaps it's the loss of your health. Perhaps it's the loss of a relationship. You know, there's more ways to be poor than just financially. Perhaps it's the loss of a dream. But we go through things where in our heart of hearts we start to realize, I'm poor. I need to be poor in spirit towards the Lord. You know, this sermon preaches differently to America than it would preach to a third world country. To a third world, see, most commentators say the poor in spirit and the poor, they were just interchangeable in the first century. Like the poor, you know, most of these people would be the equivalent of day laborers in our culture. And Jesus would come to him and he would say, the kingdom belongs to you. And they'd be right on. Because they didn't have so many other things as a substitute. And this morning, if I were to ask you, how's your relationship with God going? This last week, did you really spend time with God? Did you pray? Did you read your Bible? Do you love spiritual things? Or are you devoted to spiritual things? And you thought back, well, let me think. How much time did I spend praying? How much time did I spend in the Word? How much time did I devote myself to spiritual things? How much energy and enthusiasm and heart is in me about being a peacemaker? You know, whatever answer is there, you can answer for yourself what it is that in your heart you depend on. You know, for many of us, we depend on the material blessings we have. We depend on our job. We depend on our way of life. We depend on people's view of us. We depend on our reputation. We depend on our education, our friendship, our popularity. There are many things in a blessed culture we choose to depend on. Whereas in reality, what God is saying is, blessed are the poor in spirit, those who are humble enough to need me like James Braddock needed his friends at that moment. Come to me, all you're weary, and I will give you rest. You know, there was a story. I have a little illustration here. There was a story of an Eastern sort of person who was into Eastern arts and wisdom. And a man wanted to go and learn from him, so he traveled for thousands of miles. And he finally got an audience with this sort of Eastern mystical teacher. And he came in and he wanted to impress this Eastern teacher, so he just began to talk. And he began to tell him, and I'm going to kind of put my little bowl here. But he began to talk, and he began to tell him all the things that he had learned in his lifetime. And so and as he's doing this, the Eastern teacher looked at him, and he began to pour him a cup of tea like this. And the guy's just talking and talking, and so the guy pours him this tea, and pretty soon the water's running over kind of like this. And the guy stops mid-sentence, and he goes, "What are you doing?" And he goes, "Well, you're kind of like this. You have so much in your cup, you can't listen anymore. So I don't even know why you're here. And I can't teach you anything. Your cup's full. Why are you here?" For many of us this morning as we come to church, we're kind of like that. Our cup is full. There's already so many things that we depend on. So many things other than the Lord, that's a substitute, that our life is kind of like this. And here's what we need to do. And here's a little exercise I'm going to give you to do this week. I hope that as you consider your life, you'll do this. You'll say, I'm going to pour into my cup. Here's all my talents, my time, my worries, my fears, my background, my past. I'm going to pour them in this cup. And then, before the Lord, I'm going to go like this. I'm going to say, God, here's my life, my money, my time, my energies, my worries, my past, my knowledge, my education. I'm going to pour it out on your altar. I'm going to pour my cup on your altar. And then I'm going to say, God, here's my life. It's an empty cup. Fill it. This week, I want to ask you to do that. To go before God and say, God, here is my life. I'm poor in spirit. I'm an empty cup. Fill it for me. Fill me with the Spirit. Strengthen me in my life. I'll devote myself to you first. I'll come to you first. I'll pray. I'll walk with you. I'll know you. He says, blessed are the poor in spirit, for yours is the kingdom of God. You know, over the next few weeks, as each one of these attitudes unfold, if you will embrace them, then God will make you a peacemaker. Blessed are the peacemakers, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Amen.